Pursuant to S-Con Res 1 and Section 17 of Title 3, the United States Code, when the two houses withdraw from the joint session to count the electoral vote for separate consideration of an objection, a senator may speak to the objection for 5 minutes, not more than once. Debate shall not exceed 2 hours, after which the chair will put the question, shall the objection be sustained? The clerk will report the objection made in the joint session.
Objection from Senator Hawley from Missouri and Representative Perry from Pennsylvania. We, a United States Senator and member of the House of Representatives, object to the counting of the electoral votes on the state of Pennsylvania on the ground that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given.
Majority Leader.
I know no further debate.
If there's no further debate, the question shall be, shall the objection submitted by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, the senator from Missouri, Mr. Hawley, be sustained? Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Murphy. No. Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. No. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No.
On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 92. The objection is not sustained. The Secretary will notify the House of the action of the Senate, informing that body that the Senate is now ready to proceed to joint session with further counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, for the information of all of our colleagues, we don't expect additional votes tonight. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that upon the dissolution of the joint session, the Senate stand adjourned to then convene for pro forma sessions only, with no business being conducted on the following dates and times, and that following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session. Friday, January the 8th at 10 a.m., Tuesday, January 12th at 12:30 p.m., Friday, January the 15th at 10 a.m. I further ask that when the Senate adjourns on Friday, January 15th, it next convene at 12 noon on Tuesday, January 19th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Finally, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.